Variable contrast papers have revolutionized darkroom printing, offering just the ultimate control using a single paper stock. And thanks to papers like Ilford's iconic multigrade and others like it, we can manipulate contrast effortlessly. How? Well, it's pretty simple, by using different color light. We use blue light when we want more drama, increasing the contrast, and we use green when we want to mellow things out, reducing contrast. But what are variable contrast papers and exactly how do they work? That's what I'm going to break down right now in this video. Variable contrast papers are papers that allow you to control different levels of contrast using filters during the exposure. And unlike graded papers, which have a fixed range of contrast, variable contrast papers can go from really low contrast to really high contrast. And they do this by blending two different layers in the emulsion, one that's sensitive to blue light and one that's sensitive to green light. And the emulsion that responds to the blue light is responsible for the higher contrast part. The green sensitive emulsion is responsible for the low contrast. So by varying the amounts of blue and green light, you can mix different ranges of contrast. So variable contrast papers are what's called orthochromatic. So they are sensitive to the green and the blue spectrum of light, but not the red spectrum. And that's why we're able to use safe lights or red lights and not fog and expose our paper. So again, these two emulsions work together, and their combined response to the exposure and the color of light in the exposure determines the overall contrast. So now if I take a look at the filters that we use for variable contrast printing, the zero filter or the low contrast filter is kind of an orangish yellow color, and that blocks the blue light from hitting the paper, making it less contrast because you're basically only left with the green spectrum of exposure. Then if you go up to the higher contrast, a number 5 filter, it's very magenta, which gets rid of the green light and leaves more of the blue spectrum to expose, making it high contrast. Then in between that, there's a gradation that goes from a 0 all the way up to the 5, and it kind of reduces the blue light at the 0 end all the way, kind of mixing the two in here, and then all the way up to the 5 where it eliminates the green light. And variable contrast papers can produce a range from like a -0 or a 0 all the way up to 5, and in some cases like a 5+ or an extended range. And this really does depend a little bit on the paper, the filters, and your light source. So again, the way the filters work is a 1 is going to produce less contrast than a 2, and a 0 is going to produce less contrast than a 1. However, there is no real standard for these filters and papers between manufacturers, and that's why it can get confusing. And it's really important to test your materials and equipment so you know what your contrast ranges are from your filters, from your equipment, and your paper. For instance, if you use, say, a 2 filter, you could be getting an actual grade, like a contrast grade of 1 with a certain developer and paper. And if you don't know that, it's hard to optimize your negatives and prints for a standard grade because you don't know what your filters are giving you. And now you can use single filters or a combination of filters to achieve different levels of contrast. So the single filter is just, like it says, using a single filter, and split grade printing is using a combination of filters to arrive at that a single contrast. And if you're using a single filter, you can always build up on that with other filters to kind of tweak different areas in the same print. And with split grade printing, you can also manipulate while you're exposing through each filter, which becomes very, very powerful. I would say split grade printing is not as necessary as people make it out to be. And I would always recommend that you start off learning a single filter system. It's just going to make your life more consistent and repeatable. The next thing with variable contrast filters and paper is that you want to do what's called speed matching. Now, this is the idea that you can keep a consistent exposure while changing filters. Now, what Ilford does and other manufacturers do is They put neutral density in the filters to try and keep the exposures the same. And they typically, like Ilford's, for an example, from the 0, to about the 2 or the 3 are really, really consistent. And then the 4 and the 5 are usually about a stop more, but like my 5, like it goes up a little bit more than that even. However, the point that they match these filters is usually in the middle. And that's not as helpful as it is to have a highlight speed matched. And through all the testing that I've done, the way their filters and papers are matched, there's always some variance in exposure kind of throughout. Like 0 through 3 is definitely closer and 4 and 5 are more together, but there's variations all the way through in my experience. And this is why it's important to speed match and test your papers for a highlight. And it's really simple to do this test, and then that will allow you to make a factor system so you can easily go from filter to filter and keep the exact same highlight exposure, because we typically want to expose for the highlights and adjust contrast for the shadows. And let me know down in the comments below if you'd like to see a video kind of breaking down in how to do that. And while you're at it, hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up, because you're not going to want to miss future darkroom videos. So there are 2 different kind of types or makes of variable contrast papers. One is resin coated and one is fiber based. Now, if you're just starting out in the darkroom, I would probably recommend going with resin coated papers. They're easier to handle, they develop quicker, they're a little bit more robust and not as easy to damage. And they also have shorter wash times. Now, fiber-based prints are kind of the end all and be all, like they're just the best of the best. They do take longer to develop, but they're more archival. They kind of take toners better. They've just stood the test of time as being just the standard of a black and white print. Like they're the best. So once you kind of get to that level and are comfortable working with RC or resin coated papers, I would definitely experiment or start working your way into fiber-based, because when you get something that's really, really nice, that's going to be the end goal, is to put that on fiber-based and then have a final print that way. Now, when it comes to selecting a paper, a really great printer is going to be able to make great prints with pretty much any paper, but there are some things to consider. And the most important is kind of matching the negative and image you want to the correct paper. Because I would say like contrast range is probably one of the biggest considerations. And I've always found that Ilford papers have just an amazing contrast range with really deep, rich blacks all the way to clean, beautiful highlights. But different papers will have different image tones, and that can be in the emulsion or the silver itself and the paper base. There's different textures and finishes like glossy or luster. So these are all things to consider when you're looking to make a print, if it's going to fit the print that you want to make. And then finally, some papers just are more suitable for toning. They take toners better, and some are better if you want to get into things like hand coloring and other kind of more mixed media or things like that. So again, these are all things to consider when you're selecting a variable contrast paper. But luckily today, we still do have a really, really good selection of amazing materials that we can work with in the darkroom. So a few practical tips for printing with variable contrast papers. Test your setup. You're going to want to know what contrast range you're getting from your filters. And the only way to really, really know is to test your setup. I did touch on this before, but I think it's really, really important, because once you're tested, then you can just put up a filter exposure factor chart, and you're not trying to make a test strip every time you change filters and spending a lot of time doing it. So this is another one of those things where a little bit of work up front can give you a ton of time in the future. And I would also say experiment with multiple filters. This can give you an insane level of control over your print, and it can really help when you're dealing with like really difficult negatives. So even in a digital world, traditional printing still holds its ground. And if you're committed to black and white film and darkroom printing like I am, then variable contrast papers are pretty much non-negotiable. They just make things so much easier, and the quality of the papers today compared to when they first came out are they're really, really good. And I say all this because silver gelatin prints, they're more than just a print. They really are more of a legacy, and there's nothing else that really compares to them. And to me, this is just the ultimate expression in photography. These papers really do offer a hands-on experience that digital just can't even come close to. And imagine the satisfaction of just seeing your art or your creation coming to life just piece by piece in real time. Each print a testament to skill, patience, and vision. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're gonna really love the next one coming up right here.